Welcome everybody to the CRC Roundtable. Appreciate everybody taking time for their lunch hour today to talk with us about some important issues of carbon. I'm Tak Heinz, the director of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which is one of the partners of the Chesapeake Research Consortium, and stemming back to the very earliest days of CRC. SERC is based in Edgewater, about 5 miles south of Annapolis, on nearly 3,000 acres of land and 15 miles of shoreline on the bay, where we've been doing long-term research on coastal ecosystems connected and impacted and responding to humans in the coastal zone where most of the humans live. We do a lot of work on urbanized estuaries like Chesapeake Bay, but also work in San Francisco Bay and other places that the Smithsonian works, from the temperate zone to the tropics. This is an important opportunity for everyone to share information and have informed conversations about the scientific advances and management needs. These webinars are designed to provide contribution, not consumption. So each seminar provides a diverse range of researchers and managers and other professionals to have conversations about critical topics. Today it's about carbon. We want each speaker to take about 25 minutes to provide some introductory remarks, and then to have full time for open discussion. And we want people to be feel free to ask questions. All questions are important, whether they're informed or not, and we'll try to answer them online if we can. And if we can't get to the questions online today, we will respond afterwards and follow up to all questions collectively. So please type your name and organization into the chat boxes so that everybody can see what's going on and see who you are. We're interested to know the users of the services or the enterprise and interaction that we're doing today. So we're open and engaged. You are all part of the show, but are going to have two speakers today. This first talking about carbon, coastal cycling of carbon, and then which we call blue carbon for mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass systems, where about 50% of the ocean's carbon resides in that 1% area of the oceans. The other is what we call green carbon in forest systems, and we've been doing research, long-term research on both of those ecosystems here, funded by an array of long-term support from the Department of Energy and from National Science Foundation. So with that, I will introduce the first speaker, who is Pat McGonigal. Pat is the Associate Director for Research here at SERC, who helps me to manage the overall research program, in addition to the other public programs that we run. And Pat is a biogeochemist. He comes out of the world of Duke University, and he's been running long-term experiments, the longest running experiment of its kind, on increasing carbon dioxide impacts on natural carbon systems with unique experiments that he'll describe here at our site at SERC. But he also is engaged in developing large collaborative networks of data sharing for coastal carbon on a global basis, particularly for the United States, but many other countries around the world that are involved in understanding the relationships of carbon sequestration and blue carbon systems to climate models and carbon models for the planet. So he should go ahead, Pat.
Okay, let me try to share.
We can see that.
Okay, how are we looking?
Good.
All right, well, yeah, thanks for that introduction, Tuck, and thanks to all of you for attending this, and especially for the invitation from the CRC to have a chance to talk about what we do. And what I do has a lot to do with the topic Tuck introduced, blue carbon, and the research that underpins that. This is the Global Change Research Wetland. It's a 23-hectare marsh here at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And those structures that you see are various experiments, the oldest of which started back in 1987 by Bert Drake, who's still active here. And the goal was to understand the effects of elevated CO2 on plant growth, plant productivity. That experiment is still running, actually. It's the world's longest running climate change experiment. But we've learned quite a bit. And as we've learned things, we've posed new hypotheses and started new experiments that bring in other factors like a polluted Chesapeake Bay in terms of nitrogen, sea level rise, invasive species, warming, and the most recent experiment, which involves trying to understand the effects of storm surge on coastal forests. So a lot of very detailed work on plants and microbes. This is the conceptual model that we're operating under. On the left, we have these global change factors that I just mentioned. Those are influencing ecosystem processes in one way or another, both plants, microbes, and the combination of their interactions on soil surface elevation, which is critical to understand in coastal wetlands for reasons I'll explain in a minute. And what comes out of that are the ecosystem responses that we're interested in, including the stability of the system or its resilience, but in the context of what I'll emphasize in this talk, carbon storage. These coastal wetlands, marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses are hotspots, like Tuck mentioned. Less than 1% of the ocean area is what they occupy, and yet you've probably heard that they store up to half of the ocean's carbon. So that's a pretty remarkable number. But what's often lost in the conversation is that they also emit up to half of the ocean's methane. And I bring this in because methane is actually a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And so understanding the balance of the carbon dioxide removed and the methane added turns out to be critical to how you would manage these systems for carbon or climate benefits. So I thought I'd take just a moment and explain why these coastal wetlands are hotspots for carbon sequestration. And to illustrate that, I'm going to start 10,000 years ago on the left side of this x-axis. When sea level was rising globally at a very high rate, we had all these ecosystems on the planet at that time, but as sea level rose, they either moved or were drowned out. And so there was no way for a wetland to actually stay in place or for its carbon to stay in place. But then once the rate dropped dramatically 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, that's when marshes that established worldwide, including here in Chesapeake Bay, have stayed right where they are and been able to increase their elevation at the same rate that sea level's been rising. And of course, that means that these wetlands are persistent in the landscape, but they've also stored a tremendous amount of organic matter in their soils over this period of time. And again, this is key to understanding the hotspot idea. And the work that we're doing in this research wetland is really about the fact that the rates of sea level rise are accelerating once again, and we know that we'll at some point cross this tolerable rate, and at that point these systems will start to degrade, and so that's the big picture. Now I mentioned methane, and I'll say something more about that, which is that there's a relationship between the carbon that's being stored through CO2 uptake by plants and then sequestration in soils and the amount of methane that's emitted. You cannot really uncouple these things. It's a yin and yang situation with these two. And so anything you do to increase storage, which would of course have a negative effect on radiative forcing or a cooling effect, is going to be balanced in some way by an increase in methane emissions, which would have a warming effect. And so understanding how that works at a very detailed level is important. And one reason is that because if you're going to restore these systems for carbon benefits, you need to defeat this. You need to somehow overcome this. One of the most important relationships in this regard is the relationship of methane flux with salinity. And here on the y-axis, we have the log of methane flux. And you can see that it decreases dramatically the saltier we get. And the reason is that it has to do with microbial competition and the fact that with salinity comes sulfate. So salinity here is a very strong feature of these systems. Now, if I were to plot the amount that the amount of carbon sequestered on the same graph as a function of salinity, we'd find out that there really isn't much of a relationship. That these systems tend to sequester the same amount of carbon regardless of salinity. And so when you put these two together, and of course they're not just lines which are averages, but ranges, because there's a lot of variability in here. What you come up with is that depending on how conservative you want to be, you should be putting your carbon projects at salinities greater than 20 or at least greater than 12, which would, constitute a lot. Chesapeake Bay, for example, would not necessarily be good for these projects. But again, there's a lot of variability. So where would these projects, where would you want to put a project, a coastal wetland project that you're hoping would have some climate benefit to it? Well, one option is to put it in a seagrass bed, because even though seagrasses store relatively small amounts of carbon compared to marshes and mangroves, they also emit relatively little methane. And a good example of this is the world's largest and probably most famous seagrass restoration, which is right here on the outer coast of Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, where J.J. Orth back in 1999 started planting seagrass. And Matt Oreska did a very good job of measuring all the greenhouse gas consequences of these restorations. And that's the data that I'm showing. So you see that carbon is also sequestered in unvegetated sediments. That's worth noting. And these unvegetated sediments, that's in blue. And in red, these sediments emit a certain amount of methane. But much more carbon is sequestered in the presence of seagrass without a whole lot of more methane being emitted. And so the net effect of this is a positive greenhouse gas benefit of 0.5 ton per hectare per year from this restoration. Another opportunity that comes out of this basic research has to do with something we call tidal reintroduction. And this case study is from the Herring River in Massachusetts. Kevin Kroger, Megan Eagle, and others at the USGS have been working hard on this. And what you're seeing in this map is a red line that represents where a dike was added back in 1909. Now, before the dike, the area outlined in green was one large tidal wetland, tidal marsh. After the dike, and because of its restriction, just the area in yellow is tidally flooded. The rest of the area is still wetland, but it's fresh. It's much fresher than it would have been. And as a result, it's emitting a lot less methane. So they've done some work measuring emissions from within this diked area and the area in green compared to reference sites. And what you're seeing here is, again, this carbon CO2 sequestration number. And in red, it's telling us that the impounded area is having a net warming effect. But if you restore it, well, the non-impounded area has a cooling effect. So presumably, if you restore tidal hydrology by removing the dike, you'll get a greenhouse gas benefit, a pretty large one. So of course, to do this at scale requires more information, and this is where Kevin Kroger has been collaborating with Jim Holmquist here at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And what Jim did was, first of all, to use GIS classification and mapping to identify throughout the US where these tidal restrictions exist. That's step one. Then in step two, to estimate what the salinity of the water inside and outside the impoundment is. And then step three, to take those relationships and figure out for whether any given site would go from fresh to mesohaline or polyhaline or some combination of those changes. And what he came up with is that about 25% of the sites across the US would actually have a positive greenhouse gas benefit. Now, I would have liked that to have been 75%. It's not, but this helps us target where these activities should be focused. And here's a map of all the sites in the US that and their potential greenhouse gas benefits that you can visit. Jim is also the director of the Coastal Carbon Network, and this is the SERC team that works at least somewhat on this coastal carbon problem, including Steve Canty, who's the PI of the Marine Conservation Lab, Jackson Wolf, and Hannah Morissette. Our goal is to accelerate coastal carbon science and action. One of the products of the network is this atlas that has nearly 15,000 observations worldwide in marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses, including a lot of observations right here in the mid-Atlantic area. And the type of thing we can do with that is grade the states as to how well their coastal carbon data can support policy. And you can see the West Coast is doing pretty well. The East Coast is a mix, but this helps incentivize more observations and work. And we can also use that data in the database to help nations and states and even counties understand their coastal carbon assets. And then what Steve and Hannah do is use those resources to help. For example, this is a case with Belize where they help develop nationally determined contributions for Belize that can bring their coastal wetlands into policy instruments. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Pat. That was great. Just for the listeners, we're going to go and have both presentations before we come back to questions after John has a chance to talk. So the next speaker is John Parker, who's also a research scientist here at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, senior scientist who's been working on terrestrial ecosystems. He comes out of Georgia Tech back a while back, where he was also working on marine systems. So he's got a broad spectrum, but he's been working on a particularly interesting large-scale experiment testing the effect of tree species diversity on forest restoration. And he's going to tell you about that. It's called BiodiversiTREE. Get it? Because it's biodiversity of trees. We're very clever in our communications, and I'm sure Bill out there, who's the communicator, will appreciate that. But this is an experiment that's running. I think this is the 11th year now. And so we're getting some really interesting results from that John will describe to you. And it informs and advises restoration, especially with respect to biodiversity, but also carbon processing and sequestration. So John, please go ahead. You're sharing your screen now, so that's great.
Yeah, cool. Can you hear me, Tuck?
Yes, I can.
Audio turned off. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction, and thanks for Denise for inviting me to do this. And I appreciate the call out to marine systems from both of you. Pat, you mentioned the world's most famous seagrass restoration. That was actually, I worked on that in my master's. I got my master's with J.J. Orth on that exact same seagrass bed in part. And so that was kind a nice little call out. But let's move on land. So as Tuck mentioned, I do a lot of forest ecology work now. And what I'm going to do today is talk about this big experiment that Tuck talked about, where we're really trying to look at whether or not tree diversity is an important driver, not just for carbon storage, which is obviously important in this time, but for a lot of the other co-benefits that we get from forest ecosystems. Okay, so a few years ago, the UN declared this particular decade is the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And this is really recognizing that if we want to regain some of the functions that we've lost over the last several decades of habitat degradation, we're going to have to take a whole ecosystem approach to ecosystem restoration and try to restore some of the functions that we've lost over the years. And on land, this really means forest restoration. So even though forests only take up about a third of the terrestrial land surface, they're about 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity and about 75% of terrestrial carbon. And so when we're talking about ecosystem restoration on land, in a lot of cases, we're really talking about forest restoration. Now, I'm sure many people that are here today have heard a lot about tree planting efforts as a natural climate solution. They've probably been a little bit oversold, but nevertheless, this is a huge deal right now and going forward. It's something like an area roughly the size of India has pledged to be planted with trees in the next 10 years or so. And things like the 1 trillion tree pledge are a big part of this. Now, from a scientific perspective, one of the big problems is there's almost no monitoring that goes on with these planting efforts. And in fact, many of these planting efforts fail, oftentimes because they pick the wrong species in the wrong area and for a few other reasons. And so we started this experiment about 10 or 11 years ago to really sort of put some meat on the bones and try to figure out what is the right way to do a forest restoration. In particular, whether we want to get at this question of whether or not we want to plant a diverse assemblage of trees like you would find in a natural forest. So this is our experiment. I'm just going to circle it here. It's a giant experiment in terms of how these ecology experiments typically go. This is a house for scale up here. So every one of our plots is about the size of a typical rural yard. We have 75 of those plots. It's all told, it's about 60 acres. There's 20,000 trees. They're all native species. If you want to walk up to each and every tree to take a measurement, it's a literal marathon or over a marathon, about 27 miles. We have a whole series of sensors and monitoring devices out there, a couple miles of that. And because trees are big and they last a long time, we've designed this to last for 100 years. So sometimes we call it our 100-year experiment. Now, why diversity? So, I think intuitively we all kind of understand that you need the right tool for the right job, right? If you want to complete a job from beginning to finish, you're not going to use the same thing to get everything done. It's the same way in the plant world. So different species do different things, right? And so this diverse assemblage over here on the right, you have a lot of different species. Some are short, some are tall, different rooting depths for accessing different nutrients and water at different depths. And they're differentially susceptible to diseases and pests. And so if you have a monoculture like here on the left, the idea is if a pest moves in, it might knock out all these species here, but if you have a diverse assemblage, you have some redundancy built into the system to cover for those losses, which is important in the time of global change when you have a lot of different challenges. Now, unfortunately, at the global scale, most forest planting efforts are not diverse assemblages. In fact, they're monocultures. 7% of the world's planted forest area is a monoculture that looks somewhat like this. This is a pine plantation in Ireland. And that's because we often grow these monocultures for timber. And they're particularly good at that. But you can kind of look at this and tell this is not that great of a habitat for native wildlife, for the understory communities that live in there, and for all the other ecosystem services that you get out of a forest. And in reality, it just looks nothing like a native forest. So let me orient you here. This is our experiment. I'm sitting underneath this yellow star in this SERC campus here. All of this sort of dark outline, this is the SERC campus. This is Muddy Creek Road, if you're familiar with the area. Road River here, the Chesapeake Bay is out here. These are all of my plots. The single colors here, this is a dogwood monoculture. This is a sycamore monoculture I'm going to show you in a second. And if you have a mixed species assemblage, just these multicolor plots right here. And so what we have are 32 plots where a single species monoculture, i.e. just like that pine plantation I just showed you. Then we have a 4-species mixture. This is about the average diversity you'd find in a local forest. And then 12 species planted together in a plot. This is the high range of diversity. So in other words, we have low diversity, middle diversity, and high diversity little replicate forest plots throughout this landscape. We also have 5 plots I'm not going to talk about. They're natural regeneration controls. In other words, what would happen if we just let nature take its course? Okay, if you're familiar with native species, they're the most common ones I use in our experiment: tulip poplar, sycamore, beech, red maple, red oak. Really the most common things you're typically going to find in a native forest. Here's what it looked like in 2013. We planted everything from bare root seedlings. So you see these tiny little sycamores here. And one of the things I'm going to tell you about first is sort of tree growth and biomass, because this is really where the carbon is in a forest. Okay, after a couple of years, you can see these trees, especially the sycamores, are starting to grow pretty fast. Not much else is happening with the other species. But by 2023, last year, these trees had really popped. So some of these sycamores now are well over 50 feet tall, and you're starting to see things like the oaks really sort of take off in the background. Okay, what about growth and biomass? Because that's where the carbon is. Well, at some level, you can really just walk around out there and see the differences. So this is a sycamore tree inside of a monoculture like those ones behind you, paper bag for scale. What you can see is these trees are growing really tall and skinny because they're competing with each other for light. So they're kind of going to reach the horizon really quickly to get light. So they're tall and skinny trees that kind of look like lollipops. But in a mixture, that same species is a little bit shorter, but much fatter. And for a tree, that's where all the biomass is. It's in the trunk. The woody tissue density is really in the trunk. And so what we can do is we can convert those measurements into biomass gains. That's what we're showing you here. This is the above ground biomass in a monoculture plot. All the mean of all of our monoculture plots are 4 species mixtures and our 12 species mixtures. And what you see is there's about 50% more biomass in a mixture plot compared to a monoculture plot on average across all of these. Let's talk about the units here real quick. This is megagrams per hectare, which it doesn't really mean a whole lot for most people. It's kind of esoteric, but a hectare is about the size of a New York City block. Now, this is about a 15 megagram difference between the mixtures and the monocultures, which also doesn't really mean anything. But to put that into context, it's about adding an extra T-Rex for every New York City block and extra forest biomass, just by virtue of growing a mixture of species together rather than a monoculture. So that's a huge gain. And if you want to convert it to tons, it's about 6 to 8 more tons of carbon per city block by virtue of just growing a mixture versus a monoculture. So a huge advantage. And if you don't like T-Rexes, it's the same thing as like 1 elephant per city block. All right, above ground biomass can get cut down, decay, and go to the atmosphere. So really where a lot of the action is in forests is below ground soil carbon storage. We've done a lot of work on that over the years. I want to show you here, this is a picture of some cores, some representative cores from a mixture. Right here, you can see it's kind of dark. It's got a lot of root mass in it right here, right there. This is a core from a monoculture. It's much sandier. You don't see that dark organic matter. You don't see a lot of roots. So this is enriched with carbon. And when we analyze that, we get about 12% more carbon in the soils in a mixture plot compared to the monoculture plot. So again, both more above ground carbon storage and more below ground carbon storage just by virtue of planting multiple species together compared to a monoculture. I want to sort of move on real quick and talk about a few co-benefits that we get from a forest. So one of the things we like about trees is the shade they provide, both locally, but you can also see this at the landscape scale. So these dark light blue areas, National Arboretum and Rock Creek Park, these are much cooler on average. This is a thermal map of Washington, D.C. area than these hot urban city centers. So we like trees for the shade and the temperature they provide. We have a whole series of sensors out there. And what I'm just going to not show you the data, but just talk about it. But what we find is much better microclimates in these mixtures. They're cooler in the day, warmer at night, higher humidity and wetter soil, which is really good for all the things that live inside these forests. For example, the insect diversity, which is roughly 50% higher in a mixture compared to a monoculture. Now, this is good for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is, insects are the base of the food web. And so when you have higher insect diversity and abundance, you typically find higher bird diversity, which is another thing that we've been monitoring. Now, not all insects have we sort of wanted to find in our plots. So if you guys remember the big cicada outbreak from a few years ago, one of the things about having a big experiment like this is if you build it, they will come. So when things happen over time and you already have this experiment out there, you get a chance to monitor things as they're happening in real time. And so when the cicada outbreak happened, we got out there really quickly and wow, they did a lot of damage. So this is our white oak monoculture plot up in the front of the one of our parts of the experiment. And all this dead stuff right here, these are dead branches caused by the cicadas laying eggs and the branches, and they start to eventually sort of fall over if you get enough oviposition damage, and they do what's called flagging. It doesn't kill the trees, but it prunes them back a lot. So we quantified the damage, and what we found is that our diverse plots actually had 85% lower cicada damage compared to the monoculture plots. So not only do we get more of the beneficial insects, you have more resistance to these pest insects just by having these multiple species planted together. And we think what's happening is the cicadas do have preferences, and in a mixture plot, they have a harder time finding their preferred host, and so they sort of give up and move on. Okay, I don't want to bombard you with data, but we've looked at all of these things here on the left, and in general, what we find is that tree diversity has a positive impact on multiple ecosystem functions, which is important. So this is one of our polyculture plots here. It starts to look a lot more like these mixed species assemblage of native forest here that are feeding into the Chesapeake Bay here in the background. I encourage everybody to come out and take a walk through our plots if you get a chance at some point. Importantly, it's not just a case study. So there are a few studies here in North America, but we have about 32 now experiments worldwide. We're very similar experimental designs. There's over 1 million planted trees. And what we can do with all of these very similar experimental designs is we can pool our results together and try to get a consensus on scientific questions. And we've done that in several cases. And one of the things that have come out of this effort is we've started writing policy papers where we're trying to convince people, to get away from planting these monocultures and start planting these mixed species assemblages because they're more resilient to pests, they have multiple functions. And so in reality, what we should be doing going forward is less of this and more of these native looking forests in order to improve multiple functionality. So hopefully I've left, some open spots for questions to ask, but again, I appreciate everyone coming here to listen to us talk about our research. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Great talks, both of you. I think we learned a lot. These are opportunities. So we'll try to go to questions, and Lauren, maybe you can help me manage these because I don't see the questions here. So
they'll be in the chat. So there's one from Denise already. Can you identify some rich current policy targets for the application of both these areas of research?
yeah, so can you start with that, Pat, on the application of your coastal carbon?
Yeah, well, the policy efforts with respect to carbon recognize the fact, like John mentioned, that really carbon is just one way of valuing these systems, that these co-benefits are hugely important. And so the policy efforts that I think are most rewarding are trying to, first of all, help countries and even smaller government units bring these systems into their accounting in the first place. And so at an international level, the Paris Agreement and its emphasis on nationally determined contributions is an example of policy that has really, first of all, helped us understand where these systems are and how they're being impacted by a whole variety of human activity and also just natural perturbation like sea level rise. And then beyond that, I'd say policies that link carbon to other ecosystem services like water and pressing those forward, including biodiversity. Biodiversity, by the way, there's a lot of talk about whether carbon credits and biodiversity credits can be linked. That's a rich area.
Thanks, Pat. John, can you comment?
Sure, yeah. On the tree side, I think the document that I just shared and showed the title of, part of that was really to get at people who are doing tree plantings at the sort of the large scale level. The drawback and the difficulty there has been, in a lot of cases, people are using mechanized planting and mechanized harvesting, and there's sort of a hesitance to do things differently than what they've done in the past. And so, we've tried, very hard to talk to people, foresters in particular, who are planting and harvesting things to say, okay, let's start at the small scale. Can we plant 2 or 3 species, which have roughly similar growth forms and strategies, so you can get your gear in there and take things out? So I think from the plantation side of things, that's where we've sort of focused our efforts. The second part has been a little more nebulous, and that is these reforestation efforts, which happen fairly frequently, but they don't often have single points of contact because they're smaller in scale and typically. And so that has been a little bit more difficult target audience to reach. But I'd say those are our two biggest efforts where we're trying right now to make some impacts.
John, are there any negative aspects of forest function that happen with increased tree diversity?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're seeing in our experiment, and I don't know how generalizable it is across all experiments, because most experiments exclude large herbivores, but in our experiment, we didn't exclude white-tailed deer, and we actually see a little bit more browsing in the more diverse plots from white-tailed deer. And if people have planted trees in their yard, or if they've ever done a restoration experiment, they can have a huge impact on tree growth. But it comes with a little bit of a silver lining in that the trees that don't get eaten actually seem to be doing a little bit better because they have less competition from these other competing species when deer browse them down to lower levels. And so I think so far for us, that's the biggest negative impact of diversity, is more browsing.
Great. Pat, can you comment on a question, whether there's well, there's certainly a difference, but a preference maybe, and difference between blue and green carbon sequestration, comparing the forest versus the coastal wetland systems?
Yeah, well, actually, my first thought goes to all the things they have in common. Now, of course, the biggest contrast is the fact that green carbon systems have most of their storage occurring above the ground, and in these coastal systems, it's below the ground. But aside from that, they both, in terms of management practices, have some of the same threats. The permanence of these things is an issue. There's a question here about fire, and I'm sure John can verify that, fire can wipe away a lot of forest productivity very quickly. That actually can happen in wetlands too, but in wetlands, particularly coastal wetlands, we're more worried about loss of these systems due to sea level rise and the fate of the carbon that was in those soils when that happens. The other distinction I would say is the one that I emphasize in my talk, which is methane. So in the case of the wetland system, the fact that these wetlands are such strong sources of this other greenhouse gas means that it's a constraint on one side, as I said, and on the other side, it has some benefits. So it can work against a project and for a project very strongly, and therefore can be a focus of the management or the intervention. Whereas in upland systems, it's just a much more negligible impact of methane.
Yeah, I would just add a quick aside, which we won't get into today, but Pat is also in the process of doing a series of experiments on forests, the hardwood forests here that are being inundated by both coastal runoff, freshwater flooding, and also by sea level flooding events during storm surges, as a separate experiment and a separate conversation, but we're also pursuing that.
If I can just add something on that real quick, Tuck. We had a paper out last year where we kind of looked at that question at a continental scale for the US using sea level rise projections and calculations about how that would impact, on the one hand, loss of forest productivity at the coast, but gains in soil carbon sequestration and methane emissions. And it turns out that the two more or less offset each other. The loss in sequestration in wood was made up by the gain in sequestration in soil. And so it was an interesting exercise where those two things intersect, that we would get a null result like that.
Thanks. John, can you comment about the natural recruitment plots, the 5 plots that were not initially planted, and how they seem to be performing sort of in general compared to the other diversity plots?
Yeah, I want to real quick, I want to answer the fire question really quick,
Okay,
and
sure.
then I'll do the natural regeneration plots. So I put a couple of links in the chat window there. One is to the Global Tree DivNet Consortium, their experimental design. There are none that examine fire, and then a secondary subset of experiments that have a lot of manipulative portions to them. Also no fire, but they're doing things like native exotic trees, water availability, fertilization. Yeah, so to my knowledge, no one has manipulated fire as a treatment variable because they don't want to lose their experiment, is my guess. The natural regeneration plots in our experiment are really interesting. So around here, sweet gum recruits like crazy. And so our natural regeneration plots are very dense. It's hard to walk through them, but they're almost all one species, mainly just sweet gum trees. And what we've been able to do is do a lot of work in there, and we look at, so they do have more biomass per area because they're much more dense. But the stand complexity, which is an important component of productivity in terms of light interception, is much lower in these naturally regenerating plots. And so ultimately, the mixture plots look a lot more like a natural native forest. And so one of the things we've been able to do is use various proxy measurements to see, in terms of like successional age, our mixture plots look, at least in terms quantitatively, more like a 20-year-old plot, and our naturally regenerating plots look kind of their age. They're full of a single species, not very high diversity, and therefore low diversity of insects and everything that utilize those plots. And so they're kind of moving along as expected, and it seems like what we've done with our mixtures is we've accelerated succession towards a quicker trajectory of getting to where they want to be.
Thanks, John. Pat, I know that you have an interesting experiment layered into this about temperature. So could you respond to the question about how warming temperatures are affecting carbon sequestration generally, but particularly in the experiment on the marsh here at SERC?
Yeah, this is fairly new data that we have in our warming experiment, and what we find is interesting that at least at our site, which is at a salinity of about 8, the warming increases plant productivity, which actually helps the system gain elevation faster. And so there's a positive impact of the warming on that aspect of the marsh, which of course translates into carbon sequestration and resilience to sea level rise. However, there's also an increase in methane emissions. But when we do the math, it's having a slight net cooling effect in any case. An interesting aspect of that is that it depends on what type of species is growing. If there's the sedge that grows out here, Chenoplectus, we actually get even lower methane emissions. Or if it's something, I see a question about Phragmites, when we deal with that, we usually see higher methane emissions. So there's the plant community tends to govern the greenhouse gas consequences of warming.
Can you comment, though, there is a threshold in the temperature? You can't keep warming before there's some negative effects.
Yeah, and of course that temperature relates back to its influence on sea level rise. So in general, we're finding that at this marsh behind us, that despite the increased growth that we get at elevated CO2, increased plant growth, which helps the marsh gain elevation, and the same thing with warming, that sea level rise is rising faster than the soil surface. And as a result, we're finding the positive effects of CO2 beginning to diminish in terms of plant growth, and we expect to see the same thing with warming as well, because sea level rise is another variable out here that, of course, we don't control, but it's very much affecting our experimental results.
Yeah, and then also, can you comment on Phragmites in particular as the invasive species?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because like all these things, frag is a two-edged sword. Our data shows that it's actually helping the marsh, the part of the marsh that it's invaded, gain elevation faster, but there's also increased methane emissions. And so this is a case where, maybe the greenhouse gas story is less important than the fact that the marsh is more likely to survive sea level rise with frag invasion. Of course, frag is much hated, and there's that side of it too, the wildlife piece. But in general, that's what we find: elevated rates of soil surface elevation and carbon sequestration with frag.
Can you comment more generally on the connected ecosystems adjoining these systems, both forests and wetlands? The wetlands has issues of barriers and coastal development and their value in that. Increasingly, they're being protected in places like Florida, for example, where people really appreciated in the last hurricanes that mangroves were really a good barrier against the storm surges. But also what's happening upstream in the watershed with land use affecting some of these forested systems. The connectivity of these in the landscape is important. Do you have some comments you could add to that, John?
Yeah, so one of the things that's a big black hole really right now, sort of like thinking about this cross-disciplinary or cross-ecosystem connectivity, particularly for forest function. One of the things we do know for our site in particular is, because we have about a 30-year backdrop of water quality monitoring coming out of the system. So there's a watershed that drains through the middle of it that I didn't get a chance to talk about. But we know when we planted trees, we dropped the nitrogen concentrations in the stream that comes out of that system by about 75 to 80%. And so we saw a huge reduction in the amount of nutrients that are being leached out of the system that would go into the Chesapeake Bay. Now, even further upstream of that, whether or not that would actually impact the forest function, to be honest, that's a little bit of a black hole for us right now. It's hard to scale across systems like that. We don't have, for example, like a carbon modeling framework to get a sense for if we make a change 5 kilometers away, does it influence the forest function, downstream? I think that's a little bit of an information gap for us.
Pat, what about the coastal buffers of wetlands themselves and their value in that role?
Well, yeah, as you said, Tuck, it's been pretty well established at this point that maintaining coastal wetlands in the landscape or the seascape, has great benefits, wildlife, nutrient removal, but also protection of infrastructure. And so I feel like that is beginning to be recognized by, the coastal engineering community a bit. But there are some real challenges there. And one of them is that a lot of these systems just will not be able to gain elevation fast enough to avoid drowning. And so if you want to keep them on the landscape, they have to be able to migrate inland. So, and of course that displaces other things. It displaces forests like we just talked about. Everybody's probably seen ghost forests. And it also runs up against communities, homes and businesses. And so, that's a struggle in terms of coastal landscape planning. And then, of course, there's a whole variety of other upstream factors that impact this. Like we know that because we've been successful controlling erosion in the US, there's less sediment getting into coastal systems. And sediment's really key for these systems to maintain elevation. So yeah, there's a lot of connectivity that I think all of which is cutting edge in terms of what science we can bring to it.
Yeah, do you see any sort of preferred sites, valued sites for you laid out an issue of picking sites that would be good for carbon restoration, but other habitat restoration like brownfields or other types where it would be good to be planting trees or as in the case of JJ's experiments out on the outer coast, expanding seagrasses was a really interesting and successful experiment. But it seems like part of the thing is knowing the details of the individual species, which you have both pointed to making sure that that's a successful restoration experiment, that there's a lot of restoration of sticking things in the ground or in the water and not having a long-term successful outcome. Short-term plants growing is good, but so you have any sort of words of wisdom about people want to do restoration and thinking more scientifically about that? John?
So yeah, this is actually happening a lot in Europe and in Germany in particular. I don't, and in fact, a lot of the tree div net actually got its start in Germany, and I don't really understand the politics behind that, other than it seems like their government's really investing in reforestation. In Leipzig and other places, a lot of that involves brownfield restorations, and so these urban forests that they're putting in sort of these sort of formerly blighted areas. You know, there's. It seems like in the US, there's a little bit of a hesitancy on that because it's a safety issue to have a dark forested area in an area that already might be a little bit unsafe. And so there's, you know, it seems like there's not as much reforestation in these brownfield or these urban areas as there is happening in Germany, for example. But it's a huge opportunity to get more trees in the ground and to do some of that cooling that you're going to find in urban areas, like I mentioned earlier. And so there are a lot of advantages to doing that. For biodiversity purposes as well.
Pat, can you comment, because I'd like to re-emphasize your point about opening up wetlands along the coast that have been blocked off and become freshwater and methane emitters, rather providing, opening them through saltwater tidal exchange and changing the chemistry of that is really important. There's a lot of opportunities, I know, in Florida, my own experience, but maybe you could comment more generally on that, Jim's assessment nationally for that.
Yeah, and I'll start by saying that, in my opinion, these tidal restoration projects are going to generate the most greenhouse gas benefits from, compared to anything else that you might do in these tidal marshes, at least. The only thing comparable is where mangroves are invading marshes, which, is happening naturally. So, but if you did it as an intervention, which would be controversial, that would also be big. But within marshes, there's, when you start to map this out, there's thousands and thousands of sites just along the East Coast and many more around the US that have had these impoundments built, dikes, usually for roads. And I know there's a question here about, the policy mechanisms for removing those dikes, but in general, it seems that the policy, the local, zoning and so forth, is very favorable to those kinds of projects, and they're also relatively inexpensive because you're pulling out some dirt and putting in some culverts than some other big projects. And so I think there's actually a lot of scope for that. Those types of tidal reintroduction projects, identifying where to focus that money was the point of that work that Jim Holmquist did with Kevin Kroger and others. And so I think honestly it's teed up for some investment, and I think it's going to be very attractive to the carbon finance community.
Thanks. John, there's a question here about the cicada, double cicada brood emergence that's upon us. Do you have any words about what you expect for that? I mean, the last one was the 17-year one that was here, but it's very patchy, is my understanding. So for the present double emergence, you want to comment on that and what it means for forests?
Absolutely. So cicadas are fascinating creatures. We don't understand everything they're doing yet because they spend 17 years of their lives, or 13, depending on which species, underground. They come up for 6 weeks, mate, do their thing, and go back underground, and we don't see them again. But they have huge pervasive impacts in that short time scale up. And so what we learned in this last one is that this huge, overwhelming smorgasbord of cicadas comes out, and all kinds of birds switch from feeding on insects like those caterpillars I showed you in BiodiversiTREE to feeding on cicadas. Everything from peregrine falcons, trumpeter swans, gnat catchers, little tiny things that are just basically the same size as a cicada. everything switches and starts eating these, like just manna from the skies food approach. And what that does is it allows the insects that typically live on trees to basically have an explosion of growth. They do more damage to the trees. And then you couple that with the damage that you get from the cicadas themselves laying eggs. They take a short-term hit, but then all the cicadas die and their bodies, sort of fall on land, and those nutrients go back to the land. And over time, you sort of see a long-term, another pulse of nutrients. So it's this real top-down, bottom-up phenomenon with cicadas, and it happens over these really long time scales. And so, what we think is happening is that little short-term burst in the roots actually stimulates acorn growth 2 to 3 years down the road. And so it's ultimately a net positive when these cicada outbreaks occur for the trees, even though they take some short-term damage. So it's a really fascinating story, and it's kind of crazy it happens over the entire eastern seaboard at these very different timescales, but through these forests, these massive impacts. So cicadas are super cool. I love them. So.
Thanks, John. Well, we're about out of time. I'd like to thank our audience because they asked great questions, and obviously their interest in what we're doing is really important. It's great to have your questions and your thoughts on all of this. Thank the two speakers, John Parker and Pat McGonigal, for very well presented, good graphics and visuals. And we thank the Chesapeake Research Consortium for its convening power and its integration across the institutions, research institutions of the Chesapeake Bay region watershed, and its relationship providing information in support of better management and restoration and sustainability of our land seascape. Thanks to Denise Wardrop, who's the director for this, and thanks to Lauren for her help in organizing this. So thank you all. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Denise, at this point.
No, just thanks, Tuck. I just thought it was just wonderful to hear about all the relevancy and the potential application of the research that gets done at SERC. I don't think SERC gets enough, I don't know, visibility for all the work. So it was wonderful. Thank you. Well done.
Okay, well, thank you all. Come and visit. We're open 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. You can come and see us. All right, thanks you all, and have a good day.